Because we're working with multiple checkbox fields at once, adding category filtering is slightly more complicated than what we've done in the past, but we'll still be using all of the same techniques that we've already learned. And so that starts with building a new GraphQL query to query our categories from Craft. So we go into our data folder and we create a new file called category filters query. And then we're just going to create a new query just like we've done before. So we're going to import GQL from Apollo. And then we'll create a new query constant called get category filters. And then GQL. And we're going to name our query get category filters. And we're going to pass it one variable called group, which is how Craft is going to know which category group we are requesting. And that is an array of strings. And then we're going to create a subquery called categories. And we'll pass in the group variable. And then we need 3 fields, ID, title, and slug. And then we will export. And now we'll open up our category filters component and call this query in order to populate our checkbox fields. So we import use query from Apollo. And then we also import the query that we just wrote. And then we create a query variables object with one variable for group. And we want the dietary restrictions group, which is named diet on my Craft install. And then we call the use query hook. So data error, use query, get category filters, and then our variables. And then we'll just set up our error checks like before, only this time we won't bother to post a message if the category filters are not able to load for some reason. We just won't load the filters at all. We'll just return null and skip past the component. So now that we've queried our category data, then we're going to loop through that data and dynamically output our category checkbox items. So we'll just map through that data. So data categories map. And then we add our key, which is our category ID. And then we'll pass in our ID and name using the data that we got from our query. So we'll use our category slug for our ID and the same thing for our name. And we'll just prefix it with this cat prefix. And then the value will be our category ID. And then we'll also set up our for tag. And use our category title for the label. And then if we open up the site on the front end, we see that our categories have been populated and we've got our individual labels and values and names all populated in. So we've pulled in the categories from Craft, and so now we need to set up the listing query to accept our categories as filter parameters. So we'll go back into our entries query and we'll add a new variable to the entries query for related to. Again, this is the same as a twig template parameter. And related to accepts a slightly different type called query argument. And I'll explain a little bit more about what the query argument type is in just a minute, but we'll just go ahead and pass it down to our entries query. And we're also going to pass it to our entry count query because it affects how many results are returned. And now that we've added this related to parameter to our query, we're creating a new type of cache that can be created on our listing page. And so now we can have just a recipe listing, or we can have a search query, or we can have category filters, or we can have a search query with category filters. So we need to add another key argument to our query cache to ensure that Apollo creates a separate cache for our category filtered entries. So let's open up our cache file. And all we have to do is just add one more key arg to our key args array, and that's going to be related to. Now that we've done that, just like with our search query, we want to manage these categories in React with state. And so in order to do that, again, because these filters are going to affect the Apollo query itself, we want to use a reactive variable to manage this state. So we'll go back into our home page and we'll create a new reactive variable called query related to. And that is a make var. And just like with our search query, we want the default value to be undefined so that it is completely unset if there is no value. And then we'll add that to our query variables object related to. And then again, we use the use reactive var function and query related to. So again, this tells Apollo to pay attention to this variable, and if there's a change, refetch the query with the new variable value. Now we need to write a new event handler for when our checkbox inputs are changed in order to set this reactive variable. And so we'll create a new handler called handle category change, and we'll pass it an event. So that's the change event, or the checkbox click. And so the first thing we'll do is we're going to create a new array to store the list of categories that have been checked. And so we're going to create an array called checked categories. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to check if there are already existing checked categories inside our reactive state variables. So we will get the value from that query related to reactive variable. And again, to call the value of a reactive variable, you just call it as an empty function. So we just put a couple parentheses there. And so if this has a value, we're going to do a conditional statement here. We're going to do, if this has a value, then we want to apply the value of that state. But we don't want to manipulate this state directly. So we're just going to use the spread operator to make a copy of the state variable. So if there are checked categories existing, then we'll just copy them over in an array. If there are no checked categories, then we're going to create a new array, and the first item in that array is going to be the keyword and. And this is what that query argument type is all about when we added our related to variable to our query. So when you filter by category, you can say, show me every entry that matches category 1 or category 2. But for our dietary restrictions, what we want to do is show an entry only if all checked categories are true. So if it's both vegan and gluten-free. And so the way that we communicate that to Craft is we add this and operator to the beginning of our query argument. Okay, so now we're going to modify some data depending on whether or not our checkbox inputs are checked or unchecked. So first thing we're going to do is we're just going to create a new variable to store the value of the checkbox. Let's call the input value, and we want to explicitly cast this as a number, otherwise it comes through as a string, but these need to be numbers in order to be passed as parameters to Craft. We'll go target value. Okay, so now we're going to check if the input is checked, so target checked. If the checkbox is checked, then we're going to check if its value already exists in the checked categories array. So we'll go if it is not included in checked categories, includes input value. So if the input value of the checkbox does not already exist in checked categories, then we'll go ahead and push it into that array. And then if the checkbox is not checked, we'll go else. Then we'll remove the value of the checkbox from our checked categories array. So first we will check if that value exists. So we'll go index, checked categories, index of input value. And if a value was found, so index is greater than -1, then we will splice out that value. Okay, so one more thing we have to check is if the checked categories array is completely empty. So if there are no checkboxes currently checked, then because we're using this AND operator, we can't just check if the array is empty because that AND operator will always be there. So instead, we're going to check if it is empty except for the AND operator, and that will indicate to us that it is an empty array for our purposes. So if it only has one item in the array, and that one item is the AND operator, then we want to reset the checked categories value to undefined. And now that we have populated our value, we can apply it to our reactive variable. So we'll go query related to checked categories. And just like our search query, we want to make sure that we are resetting our offset variable to 0 because we want our filter results to start from the beginning of the list. Okay, now that we've got our handler, we just have to pass it to our category filter component. And then we also need to pass it what the currently checked categories are because we need to update that checked state value for the input itself. So we pass it query related to, and if query related to is empty, we want to explicitly pass it an empty array rather than the word undefined, and I'll explain why in just a second. So now let's go into our category filter component and pass that handler in. So we'll add our props, handle change, and checked cats, and then we will add our onChange and pass it our event. And then we need to assign a checked value for the input itself. And the way that we do that is we check if the value of this input is in the checked cats array. So we'll go checked cats includes, and again, we need to cast it explicitly as a number, ID. And this is why we had to pass an empty array when we were passing this prop, because you can't call includes against an undefined variable. You can only call it against an array. So that's just a way of preventing an error when we go to call includes. All right, so now that we've set up our handler and our checked status, let's go and check it out. There we go. All right, so we're gonna filter by vegan. Looks good. What if we want to do vegan and gluten-free? Okay, we've got these options. Now what if we want to search for something? Vegan, gluten-free with tomatoes in it, we get salsa. So not only are our category filters working, they're working in conjunction with our search query. So we can mix and match as we want to. And with that, we've finished our site. Take a minute to pat yourself on the back. This is some pretty complicated stuff. We have built a site using no less than 5 programming languages, which is pretty impressive. You've learned how easy it is to work with GraphQL using Craft CMS. You've learned how Craft CMS provides a very robust GraphQL interface right out of the box that takes minimal setup. And you've learned how to make the GraphQL experience work even faster for you by integrating a library like Apollo Client. But there's so many ways that we can make this site even better. And I encourage you to play around with thinking about how can you make this a better user experience? How can you improve performance? What are some useful features that you can add to make this an even more robust website to use? There's so many possibilities. And what we've done here is just the beginning of what's possible with all this. So I hope you found this tutorial series helpful, and I wish you luck on your future projects.